All right, so this is the second part of the poverty lecture, and in this section we'll talk about how the Census Bureau actually goes about measuring poverty. And so what the Census Bureau will do in a nutshell is there's a data collection effort, there are different data sets out there that the Census Bureau may potentially use. They use primarily the current population survey, and then the American Community Survey, and that data will be harvested in March of every year. And so the researchers will go ahead and analyze that data. And so in September of every year is when the poverty numbers get released. And so that's, of course, based on last year's numbers. So this is September 2014, and the poverty numbers were just released last week by the Census Bureau. And so what they did was they're reporting the 2013 poverty estimates. So that's just a basic overview of what the Census Bureau does. But before we dive in here, to take a closer look, I'm offering just a few different justifications for why we actually go about measuring poverty, or why we should care about measuring poverty. So certainly, measuring poverty will allow us to see where poverty is concentrated, such that given our limited resources, given the government's limited resources, we can target those resources to those most in need. We use these poverty estimates and the poverty thresholds upon which they're based to establish eligibility for different programs. We don't actually use the threshold per se. We use something called the poverty guidelines, which are sort of, there's just simple transformations of the poverty thresholds that the Census Bureau uses. So another reason there. And of course, if we care about poverty and alleviating poverty, so certainly we want to see what sort of progress we're making in the fight against poverty. So this section always feels like I'm preaching to the choir. We certainly care about poverty and eradicating poverty to the extent possible. And so that's what we're establishing here. At this point, in the face-to-face lecture, I would typically have students do this quick little exercise just to get a feel for the different issues that might arise when actually trying to measure or estimate poverty. And so I'd like you to consider, let's say, a family of three. You have a family of three, and you have two kids, right? A parent with two kids. One child is 10 years old. You have a 10-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. And you're living in Chicago in 2014. And so I'd like you to consider, so take this time to go ahead and consider how much this family would need in the way of rent, right? So how much does this family need for rent and utilities? And then also think about how much this family might need for food, the second component here, and then think about what the family would need for everything else. And when you come up with those estimates, we could say that that's probably your subjective view of what the family needs to get by. That would be a subjective conception of poverty. And so, yeah, if you're watching this video, you can go ahead and take some time to do that, right? But I'll go ahead and keep moving with the content here. So just a little bit about the history of poverty measurement. So Molly Orshansky is the person who is credited with coming up with the very first measure of poverty. She was a researcher at the Social Security Administration back in the 1960s, conducting some research on the older adult population. And so she came up with her very first poverty measure, and she conceptualized two different components, two basic components to measuring poverty. She determined that we would need some sort of threshold, or some sort of poverty line by which people should be estimated. And then, of course, you would need to count the resources in our society and assess those resources against the threshold. That was the basic idea that she had in estimating poverty for the very first time in the 1960s. And so in terms of that threshold that she was considering, so what she did to determine that threshold, she basically took some existing research at the time, which was showing that families typically spend about 1/3 of their entire budget on food. And so she took the USDA food budget, or different food budgets. She took the lowest cost food budget and multiplied that cost by 3 under the assumption that food comprised 1/3 of a family's budget. And that was our very first poverty line, or poverty threshold. And of course, that threshold was adjusted for different sizes. That's how she came up with our very first poverty threshold. Now, she didn't intend that that people would take off with this measurement, this methodology, in other words, but we've since just simply adjusted for changes in prices over time. We use the same threshold that Molly Orshansky determined today. but that was not her intent. She was just using this for research purposes, not to establish eligibility for different programs, which we do today. So in terms of what the Census Bureau does, in the way of estimating poverty, there are four major considerations for the Census Bureau when they actually estimate the extent of poverty in the US. They have to think about the resources, right? How do we count the resources when we estimate poverty? What sort of resources should we count, in other words? And then they also have to assess what's the appropriate unit of analysis. Do we consider the household? Do we consider the family unit? Do we consider the individual? How do we measure that? Is the second consideration. And then, of course, they have to determine, well, do we continue to use Molly-Olshansky's threshold, or is some other threshold appropriate? Is the third of the considerations. And then lastly, they have to consider the time frame. So what might be an appropriate time frame? Should we release poverty estimates every year? Should we release them every month, or should we do it on a long-term basis? This is the last of the considerations. So looking in a little more detail here. So first is in the way of resources. So the Census Bureau, when they estimate poverty, will count your gross cash income. Yeah, so this is before taxes, before any type of government transfers. And so if you think about things like government tax programs, right, the EITC benefits, the child tax credits, this does not, when the Census Bureau estimates poverty, they're counting your gross income. So those things aren't counted. Your EITC benefits aren't counted. It's cash income, meaning that near cash or in-kind benefits that the government provides are not counted. So food stamp benefits, right, those resources aren't counted. In-kind benefits, health insurance benefits aren't counted when estimating poverty. And so there's one other element here that I include here, and this does not include non-discretionary expenses, right? So non-discretionary expenses, what I mean by that are those expenses over which you have no control. There's non-discretionary, so things like alimony payments, right? So you get a divorce and you owe your former spouse some money, and so those resources, that's not counted when the Census Bureau estimates poverty. Child support payments, that's another non-discretionary expense. You don't have control over child support payments. That's something that the government imposes, and so those things aren't counted when estimating poverty. So just gross cash income. Second consideration is in the way of the unit of analysis, and so the Census Bureau will consider among the household unit, or maybe the family unit, or the individual. They'll consider the family unit. So anyone who is related by blood, marriage, or adoption, the resources of those individuals are counted when estimating poverty. So if you're in a same-sex civil union, right? So your partner's resources wouldn't be counted by the Census Bureau. But if you're in a state that legally recognizes marriage, your spouse, right? It'd be a spouse then instead of a partner. Your spouse's resources would in fact be counted if it's in fact legally recognized in your state, because you'd be reporting as a married couple. If you live with your boyfriend or girlfriend, that person's resources wouldn't be counted because that's, of course, someone who's not related to you by blood, marriage, or adoption. If you're in an institution, if you're living in a dorm with roommates, if you're in some other institutional setting, if you're in a nursing home, those persons' resources aren't counted. So this is the resources of non-institutionalized populations that we're counting when we estimate poverty. And then we have to think about the appropriate threshold that the Census Bureau would use. And so the Census Bureau, in short, they use Molly-Olshansky's threshold. Recall the food budget. Recall that Molly-Olshansky determined that we would take the minimal food budget, the low-cost food budget, multiply it by 3 under the assumption that food comprises 1/3 of a family's budget, and that would be our threshold. And we would just simply adjust over time for changes in prices, as opposed to changes in wages. So typically for government programs, there's either wage indexing or price indexing, meaning that those thresholds for different programs will be adjusted based on changes in prices or changes in average wages. And so for this particular threshold, that is the poverty threshold, we adjust for changes in prices over time. Note here that the threshold changes, depending on how many people you have in your family, depending on how many or how old the household head is in your family, and some different factors here. But one thing I want to note in this slide are the criticisms, right? So you may have been thinking during this discussion that that threshold doesn't seem right, and the fact that families spending 1/3 of their budget on food, that doesn't seem right, right? And so that's one of the major criticisms today is that the research will show that families will spend 1/6 of their budget on food, and so the criticism is, well, why not take a low-cost food budget and multiply by 6 as opposed to by 3? That would be a more accurate estimate of the number of persons who actually fit under the threshold, is a criticism. But you can imagine what that means politically. If you increase the threshold, if you're multiplying the food budget, the USDA food budget by 6 as opposed to by 3, that's a higher threshold. And so we have more people living in poverty, and that's not very politically popular. And so we still have yet to adjust the measure. Another criticism. So I'll just point out a few of these, but whether you're living in Chicago or if you're in the boonies somewhere, Wisconsin, or you're living in Honolulu, Hawaii, or New York, right, or some more expensive place than Chicago, these thresholds apply anywhere, right? It's a national threshold. Doesn't matter where you live. So the fact that we don't adjust for regional differences in cost of living, right, is a major criticism of the threshold. There's another more nuanced threshold based on indexing, that point that I made earlier about wage indexing versus price indexing. There's some that argue that we should be in wage indexing as opposed to price indexing. Now, most students think that that prices seem to go up faster than wages, which is true of more recent years. But if you look at maybe a 4-decade or 5-decade horizon, wages have actually gone up faster than prices. And so the argument is that we should be adjusting for changes in wages, which would leave us with higher thresholds once again, meaning more people counted under the threshold. And once again, there's some political objection to adjusting the threshold in that manner. And so just make note of some of these common criticisms of the threshold that we use today. And then lastly, the Census Bureau has to consider the appropriate time frame. Should we be looking at poverty? Should we be releasing numbers every month? Should we be releasing numbers every year? Or because the problem is mostly long-term, that is, a majority of people who actually fall into poverty stay in poverty for longer than 5 years, the research will note. Should we be releasing poverty on a long-term basis? Well, the Census Bureau measures poverty on an annual basis. As I noted earlier, the Census Bureau released poverty estimates in September of each year that show the data from last year. Okay, and so yeah, that's the last consideration for the Census Bureau in terms of estimating poverty. Now, these are the actual thresholds behind me that were released this past, well, actually, these thresholds were released prior to the actual poverty estimates, but you'll note that an individual with less than $11,888 of income is considered to be poor in our society today. Recall that doesn't matter where you live. For a family of two, if you have less than $15,142, that family is considered to be poor. For a family of three, that threshold is now at $18,552 if you have less than that amount for your family unit. Right? For all the members of your family, if you have less than $18,552, you're considered to be poor. And then on the bottom here, I just note one alternative threshold that we might use. These are absolute thresholds, as noted in the first part of this lecture, defining absolute poverty versus relative poverty. If we used a relative measure, this is one estimate that might arise. So if we took median family income, as we do for our housing programs, if we took median family income, this is from the census, once again, at $63,815 is the most recent release, 2013. Recall that 2014 releases 2013 numbers. And if we took 50% of that amount, which is exactly what the local housing authorities will do, it comes out to $31,907.50. That might be one alternative threshold to these absolute thresholds. Of course, you have a lot more people who qualify for that particular program, and this is one possibility for the local public housing authority, and the threshold that they actually use. 50% of median house or family income is what the public housing authorities use, but it's based on the median family income for that particular local area or metropolitan area. So this is a national median, I just want to note here. So I want to show you some more detailed statistics about who's actually poor in the US. And we're using Molly Ushansky's threshold The Census Bureau, we've gone through the measurement, how they actually determine poverty. There's poverty for different family sizes, and we'll look here by age and by different race or ethnicity, okay? And so these are the most recent estimates by race, ethnicity, and then by age. And so you'll note that we have an overall poverty rate of 14.5%. That's the most recent estimate. It was just released last week. It's a little bit down from last year. That's good news. It's half a percentage point down. And for different races, ethnicities, you'll note for whites, not Hispanic, right? So they're on the survey, they declared themselves to be white, and they didn't check off any form of Hispanic ethnicity. And so the risk of being poor, the poverty rate is getting at the risk of being poor for a particular group. That's 9.6% here. And then you'll note a second category here, Black alone or in combination. Some people self-identify with more than one race, and that's the last part of this description here, alone or in combination. And so that rate is a little bit higher, right? The risk of being poor is highest within this particular race category. And you'll note the different poverty rates or the risk of being poor within these different groups. So 19.9%, the risk is highest for kids. So 17 and under, the risk is highest. And then for the older adults or the elderly, the risk is lowest at 9.5%. Now this looks very much different, right, from the slide before. I'm reporting here poverty rates in the previous slide, and here I'm reporting poverty composition. So poverty rates are describing the risk of falling into poverty for a particular group, but poverty composition is slightly different, right? I'm changing the numbers around here just to show you that, just to help the students become more critical consumers of the literature, right? So you can fudge the numbers, I don't want to say fudge, but manipulate the numbers to create a much different story, right? And so these poverty composition numbers will look much different. The poverty composition is looking at the number of people who are poor, right? So the number of people who are poor, just the number of people who are poor, not the entire population. And that happens to be 45.3 million people living in poverty as of 2013. Now, within that group, right, so among the poor, poverty composition is asking among the poor, what percent is white, what percent is black, what percent is Hispanic, and so forth. That's different from looking within one of these categories and saying, what's the risk of falling into poverty for that particular group? This is saying among the poor are comprised of what, right? So that's what we're showing here. Among the poor, 41.5% of this 45.3 million people are in fact white, right? Because we have, in our population is mostly white. And so that makes sense that most of the poor would also be white. And then you'll see the composition for different racial and ethnic groups. Yeah, and then so similar picture here. Actually different from the rates, but similar to what we're seeing here. The poverty composition is actually highest among the working age population. Our population is mostly working age, and so it makes sense that most of the poor are in fact the working age population. That's a much different story than what we paint here in terms of the poverty rates. Okay? All right, just a few notes on the most recent data that was released. Like I noted before, September 14 or 2014 releases the September or the 2013 data, and 14.5% is an improvement. So we're looking all the way back to 2008 when the poverty rate was 13.2%, increased to 14.3%, increased to 15.1% by 2010, and then for 2011, 2012, it remained stagnant at 15%, and so the fact that we're now at 14.5% is a slight decline. That's some good news. So we have some good news regarding the most recent poverty estimates. And one other thing that I'll often do is, at least for purposes of this lecture, is at least take a look at changes within subgroups, right? So based on age and based on race at least. So for most subgroups, we haven't seen any sort of significant change. And by significant, I'm talking about any change greater or less than 1%. But we have two groups in particular where we saw some substantial changes, that is greater than 1 percentage point difference. And so I'm noting here Hispanics. So for 2012, the poverty rate for Hispanics was 25.6%. That's decreased more than 2 percentage points down to 23.5%. That's also good news. And we have some other good news in terms of poverty rates for kids. So 2012, that was 21.8%. and we're down almost 2 percentage points, down to 19.9%. So one last point here that I want to make about this most recent data that we have, this 14.5%. Well, what does that mean historically? Not just looking at the past 5 years or so. What does that mean in a historical context? And what does that mean in terms of a different cross-national context? And that's what I'll show here very quickly. So this is showing poverty rates and the absolute number of people living in poverty over the last 5 decades for the amount of time that we've actually estimated poverty. And so you'll note that the top line here, the top line is just the sheer number of people living in poverty. We reached a peak of 46.5 million people as of 2012, and we're down slightly to 45.3 million people as of 2013. And then the bottom line here corresponds to the poverty rates over time. And so you'll notice that the highest recorded poverty rate was back in 1960 when we first started measuring poverty. It was at 22.1%, and we've historically, we've fluctuated between 10 and 15%, which is what we've done for the last 5 years. But we're down from 15.1%, a most recent high of 15.1% down to 14.5%. That's what this little graph is showing. And these shaded regions correspond to recessionary periods. And you'll note the shaded region here, which indicates the Great Recession era into 2009, early part of 2009. And then this is looking at poverty across different national contexts. You'll note that the dark blue, pardon me for the fact that this graph here is a little bit outdated. It's from 2000, so it's much more difficult to obtain international data. And so this is the most recent year for which I have data. Admittedly, it's outdated, and hopefully I'll get some more recent data soon. But for 2000, you'll notice the dark blue. Right? The dark blue is referring to relative poverty, not the type of poverty that we measure in the U.S., but internationally it's more commonly used. So the blue represents relative poverty. You'll note that relative poverty is highest in the U.S. and Ireland, right, as of 2000. And then you'll note some of the Scandinavian countries here, Sweden and Finland with the lowest rates of relative poverty. And then the light blue bars represent absolute poverty, the measure that we use in the U.S. Some countries don't even don't estimate absolute poverty. It's hard to get Ireland and Italy data, but for the U.S., right, it used to be back in 2000 that we were at about 9% absolute poverty. We just noted that we're at 14.5%. But the UK, you'll notice that the UK and the US is high in terms of absolute poverty. And once again, you'll note some of the Scandinavian countries. Austria happens to have the lowest rate of absolute poverty. So that gives you a sense for where the US stands internationally. The US is one of the worst, right? We're one of the worst in terms of relative poverty, one of the worst in terms of absolute poverty as well. So not a very a positive or optimistic picture in terms of the international scale. So in the last part of this lecture, I'll talk about poverty and dependency and the earnings disregard, the tool that we use to address poverty and dependency simultaneously.